Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 124 in the series. Welcome back to the Yarn Room. It is a Sunday in April, and actually I'm recording a week before I'm posting because while you're watching this, I'm at a virtual knitting retreat with Melissa Leapman. It's all about Canada, Canadian makers, Canadian traditions, really fun stuff, but it's a 3-day long retreat, so that's where I am at the moment, virtually speaking, but I'm also virtually here with you, so we're gonna have a good time. I have a fun cast for you today. I'm gonna talk about yoke matching, I don't know what to call it. It was like yoke hats or hat yokes or yoke matchy, or anyway, I made a hat out of this yoke pattern, so we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about some strategies to do that if you're interested in making your own hat yoke combo. Anyway, I've also gone down a Japanese knitting pattern rabbit hole, so I'll talk a little bit about that. I've started swatching for a new pattern that is completely in translation, so we'll see how it actually goes. I'm a little nervous to tell you about it before it's complete because, yeah, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but that's half the fun, right? And then I have what I think will be a pretty interesting segment about the knitting industry itself. I'm doing some research for a new project. Those of you who have been watching a long time know that I'm a professor, and my latest project is about wool, textiles, and chemistry. And I've been doing some research on the knitting and wool and all the kind of background scene, historically speaking and then industrially speaking, about what's going on with wool. And I came across a really interesting source that I thought you all might like to know about. Maybe some of you know about it already, but we'll talk about the wool industry and getting some insight into some of your favorite companies from the kind of, the background, from like the, the like backstage view of the knitting industry. So that's a lot of fun stuff, and we're gonna jump right in, but I do need to do a little introductory few things, some like housekeeping kinds of things first, so I'll take care of that. And for those of you who are new to the cast, welcome. It's lovely to see you here. This is a podcast that's all about knitting, mostly sweater construction and design and modification, but I do all kinds of different knitting stuff. And as I said, I'm a professor, so I love digging into research and knitting and translation, and we've done book segments in the past, just tons of really interest. I try to make it, you know, like little bits of info about the knitting industry or about knitting or about the history or, you know, that kind of stuff that sometimes falls to the wayside, but it's really fun to talk about. So that's often what I'll do in here. And for those of you who are coming back, welcome back. It's lovely to see you. And the rain slash snow slash sleet just started. I mean, we are like late April now, and it is still on our dog walk this morning. I thought I was going to lose like the right side of my face. It was so cold and windy. So if you hear a little bit of the pattering of the snow sleet on the roof, I apologize, but hey, that's what happens when you have a metal roof on your house, right? So you can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, obviously here on YouTube, over on Ravelry, and Instagram, and we have a Facebook group now, and we are doing a KAL this year. It's called the First or 51st Sweater KAL. So if you are new to sweater knitting or you're making your millionth sweater, we'd love to have you in the KAL. We have tons of really awesome people over in the Ravelry thread who have introduced themselves and have made beautiful sweaters, and then we have a Zoom on Saturdays at 2 o'clock Eastern where we all just get together on Zoom and talk about sweaters and whatever else we're knitting. So it's a fun group, and if you're interested in getting involved, please just email me at knittingthestash@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to send you the Zoom info. So yeah, what else do I usually mention? Website is knittingthestash.com, and that's where you can find all my upcoming classes. I do have a workshop coming up in June. It's a virtual workshop, but it should be fun. And I also teach online and via Teachable. You can find patterns over there, and you can find the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, where I specialize in small batch farm yarns, farm to skein yarns, and I love working with those producers and featuring them on the website. So tons of stuff going on at knittingthestash.com. And for those of you who have made it this far in the introduction, I do have a new destash page up there now. Yeah, I know. I have a lot of yarn in my private collection, and sometimes I need to cycle through and push some of it to a new home because I'm not going to use it in any kind of timely way. So I put up a destash page, and if you go to the main website and you on the top bar, if you click on the more, it'll say more up at the top, it'll pop up with destash, and then you can go over to this separate page. And I've put some destash yarns up there. I also have some freebies up there, so it's kind of like, don't race over there, but do. All I'm asking is that for some of the yarn that I'm destashing is that you pay shipping to you. So have at it, enjoy it, and I hope you find something that will be fun for your own projects from my home to yours. Forgot to mention, I do have a giveaway at the end. So if you're interested in getting some sparkly spring yarns for your crafting projects for this spring and summer, hang out until the end because we do have a fun giveaway going on. So let's get started with all of the fun infotainment I have for you in this episode. And first up is the matchy yoke, hat yoke, whatever I end up calling it. I'll figure that out. Or if you have some ideas, put them in the comments, please. Basically, you know from the last couple of episodes, the Tale of Two Sweaters, that I was doing this Let Lopi experiment with these two different sweaters, two different sizing, same gauge, trying to figure out if I could come up with a kind of particular set of stitch counts that would work just for my sizing. So I could always make a cool Lopi sweater, no matter what the, sizing looked like if the gauge was the same. So this was one of them. This is Weatherman. And the other one was my Lopi sweater. It was a purple sweater. Beautiful, both of them. They turned out just perfect in terms of sizing and fit and everything. So I was very, very happy with the experiment. But when I finished this sweater, I didn't immediately have something else to cast on, and that's partially because I'm a monogamous knitter for the most part, so I don't have a lot of whips lying around. I know, and I'm starting to realize the kind of horror of that now, because when I do finish a sweater and I don't have something I can just go pick up, it kind of messes with me because I'll get to the evening when I want to sit down and just pick up my knitting and knit, or I'll go to the Zoom on Saturday and want to sit there and knit, and if I don't have some ready-made project on the needles, then it's like, oh, what do I do with myself? What do I do with my hands? I'm kind of like just like jonesing for something. So I decided that since I had some extra yarn left over from this yoke, that I would just make a hat. So it kept me busy for a few evenings as I was trying to find the next sweater project. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this hat that I made and then talk about some general principles for how to convert yokes that you might really love into things like hats, and hats in particular, because you could also do mittens and dog sweaters and leggings and all kinds of things. And I was joking with the group, the Zoom group a couple weekends ago, that I still have extra yarn left over, and I'm gonna end up in like a full like matchy outfit, like with the walking the dog with the dog sweater, with the mittens and the hat, and maybe I'll make some pants. I mean, like I have extra yarn and I need something to do with it. So I've stopped at the hat so far, so let's just hope. So my basic idea with the hat was that I wanted to find a way to replicate what I loved about this yoke, which is the beautiful like gradient that happens with these different colors of Lopi yarn. And I also wanted to figure out a way to close up the top so that I'd get all the way to the white, because the white is kind of like the nice contrast to the dark, at the bottom. You kind of need the white to really like set this off the right way. But I needed to make sure that, my hat would be tall enough, but not too tall. And you can see that if I line it up here, it really blends in. That is so freaky weird. I ended up keeping most of the pattern all the way up to the very top, and this portion here is where I was able to shorten things. Now, you could make a slouchy hat, right? You could make a hat that was this entire length and it just kind of slouched off the back of your head. That would be fine too. But for me, I wanted one that's kind of like a close-fitting cap, because that's just how I wear my hats. And I wanted to figure out a way to create cool decreases at the top. Now, I did all this just on the fly. I know, that sounds terrifying. But basically I just cast on my ribbing and then started knitting the pattern. And when I got up to about, when the hat's about here on my head, about this tall, including the ribbing, I knew I needed to start doing some extra decreases, because you'll know in a yoke, you're obviously not decreasing until the neck is closed at the top. You're just doing very few decreases to kind of bring it up to the neckline. So I knew that I'd need to increase my decreases. I need to do more decreases at the top of this pattern than you see in the actual sweater yoke. So by the time I got up to about, I guess that's about 6 inches of hat, knitting very normally in pattern, I just started doing an extra decrease every other row. So an extra decrease row every other row, let me say. So, in the pattern there might be, a decrease row here or one here or one here. and they would be separated by X amount of rows. I just started making sure that I put in decreases every other row as I got up to past that 6-inch mark on my hat. And that actually allowed me to get to the right stitch count at the end, which was about 8 stitches or so that I could cinch up with my tail and then pop it in there. So the one thing I definitely did was to add those extra decrease rows. The other thing I did was to decrease or eliminate a portion of the pattern, and I decided to eliminate mostly this portion of the pattern up here because I knew that the white, as it came together in the top of the hat, would still replicate that effect of the upper portion of the sweater, but in a kind of circular fashion. So it didn't need to be as extended as it is here. It just needed to have the white with the brown. Does that make sense? So for this particular hat, those were the things I had to do. I needed to make sure that I started decreasing more often, many more decrease rows as I got up to the top of the pattern, and then eliminate a portion of the pattern so that I would be able to keep it to the right height of hat. Now the other thing that I needed to figure out early on, and that you'd have to figure out if you were going to translate a yoke into a hat, is your pattern repeat, right? And for some patterns, we talked about this with the sweater, that's a pretty easy thing to do because, you know, sizing for a hat tends to be, for adults, it's like 19 inches, 20 inches, 22, 24, something like that. And if your pattern has a very small stitch repeat of, say, it's like 4 to 6 stitches, it's easier to hit those marks. It's easier to hit the 19-inch with a full, you know, not like a quarter of a stitch or something like that, you know, to fit those full repeats in enough all the way around and still get your 19, 22, 24 inches, whatever it is. Now with this pattern, the trick was that the repeat is a bit wider. It's a 14 stitch repeat. So to hit, I think I tried to hit about 22 inches on this hat. I had to be a little bit more flexible, knowing that when I washed it, I could probably stretch it a little bit, or if I made it too big, I could try to block it down. But for me, I made it a little small and stretched it as I blocked it. And that way it fits my head just perfectly. But because of that 14 stitch repeat, I knew I wasn't going to hit 22 inches exactly. It was going to be close, you know. And I ended up with, I think it was 6 repeats all the way around for the pattern. So I'll show you what it looks like. It fits perfectly. I mean, I like hats that kind of sit like the top of my head is right here. So that's where the hat is. And the ribbing is nice and wide and snug, but not too snug. It's just one of those, it's however you like your hats, right? You can make them however you want. And I really just love the fact that it has the essence of the sweater, but just in a hat. And there were only a few minor things that I had to change in order to make that happen. So for this one, it was making sure I had the right number of stitches for the stitch repeats and that I could get close to that 22 inches. It was also making sure I did those extra decrease rows and then deciding which portion of the pattern I needed to eliminate or shorten in order to make the hat the right height for my own head. So if you wanted to translate a yoke to a hat, those are some things to think about. You want to think about your repeat for the pattern. You want to think about where you can eliminate, you know, if there are wider spaces, or, you know, if you wanted to just simply eliminate this middle row and just go with this portion of the pattern motif and then this portion, you know, you can kind of like pick and choose what you want on your hat. And then thinking about how to get those decrease rows in. For me, the decrease rows are a little bit tricky, and you can see that there is a slight variation on the hat because in this portion here, you can see that this V gets a little bit choppy. It's still very symmetrical, and it still echoes the pattern of the original, but it doesn't have the smoothness of the V that you see in the sweater. Let's see if that makes sense. And the reason for that is because that's where I started doing those extra decreases, and I wanted to make sure that I worked them into the pattern so that it wouldn't disrupt the pattern. I was just gonna kind of eliminate, you know, a couple of white stitches a little bit earlier, which meant that this needed to be a little bit steeper, you know, things like that. So as you're looking at your pattern, you can identify those places where you can get those extra decreases in without affecting the kind of like gestalt of the pattern, like the way the whole pattern actually reads and looks, if that makes sense. What else would I tell you about this? I would tell you to try it. Go for it. If you have a yoke that you love, a colorwork yoke, it's not that hard to translate it into something like a hat or a cowl. A cowl would be great because you wouldn't need to worry about the decreases at all. You could just keep it at whatever circumference you started at, probably a little wider than 22 inches, and then you could just knit straight up, and you could have your ribbing on the bottom and your ribbing on the top, and you wouldn't need to change any of the decreases or anything from the yoke to make it work. It would just turn out really nicely. So a hat is even a little more complicated. A cowl might be even simpler. But it's a great way to like do more of what you love. So if you love the way that a yoke looks, have some fun with it. Make something else out of it. See what that color pattern and that color work looks like in another form, and whether or not you like it more or the same or whatever. And either way, you get like the total matchy experience here, which you can't quite see that. It's really quite funny when I put it on top there, because it looks like the yoke just continues up to the top of the mannequin's head. Anyway, that was my matchy yoke experiment, and I really love it. I love the way this turns out, and yeah, I hope you'll try it too. Now, after I finished that hat, I will admit that there were a couple of days of absolute floundering. I found a shawl that I thought I'd like, and I picked out yarn from my stash, and I caked it up, and I started knitting it, and I decided that I absolutely hated it. Just didn't like the way it was looking, and I tried it with another yarn, and it was one of those shawls with a stitch pattern where it was like the stitches were really finicky, and I just thought to myself, this isn't how I want to spend my time. And I know that as knitters, sometimes we feel like, oh, we have to complete a project, or we pick something up and we need to finish it, or, you know, oh, I should just get through that part that I don't like. Well, I'm here to tell you, like, sometimes I pick up a project and I try it and I don't like it. And so I put it down and I'm just like, I'm not going to do that. It's not my thing. So that was a couple of days after the hat. And all this time I was waiting for my sweater yarn to arrive for my new Japanese knitting pattern. And I went down quite a rabbit hole before finding this pattern, and all because there were a couple of patterns on Ravelry that I had in my favorites, where I'll often go when I'm between sweaters, like, oh, I need to find a new sweater. And there were a couple that were in my favorites that I couldn't just, they're not downloadable on Ravelry, so I needed to go look and see which books they were in. They were in these Japanese knitting books. And then I found someone on Etsy who was selling the Japanese knitting books, and of course, not just one Japanese knitting book, but like multiple. So then of course I started looking through all of these knitting pattern books and getting a sense of who were the kind of big names in Japanese knitting and what are kind of the trends and the styles. And I found this other, I ended up buying a couple of Japanese knitting books, which I'm really excited about. I'm kind of waiting for them to get here. But in the meantime, I found yet another pattern that I love that had just come out in 2021, I think. It's called the Twig Pattern Pullover by Yoke, and I'm going to throw a picture up in here so that you can see what the original looks like. I just love this sweater. It is, there's something about the tweedy texture of the yarn, the really subtle, delicate, twisted stitches that are in the main body of the pattern. There's just something about it that I love. So I was like, okay, I need to find this pattern. And I will let you know that finding the actual pattern was not easy, because it says you can go to this particular website and buy it, but the website seems to believe that you're in Japan, and it all worked out fine. PayPal was fine with the whole thing. But it took quite a bit of doing to get a hold of this pattern. And what I found is that a lot of maybe this particular designer, or maybe some other Japanese knitting patterns, they're not patterns in the sense of what we might expect in like the US or the UK. They're called recipes instead, and they're for maybe one size with the ideas about how you would go about putting that size together, and then you're expected to infer kind of the rest and know what you're doing. So it was always going to be a knit in translation and then, you know, an actual like creation of a pattern from this recipe. So I took on that task, and that's one thing that I did do in the evenings in between my knitting projects. So I worked with, as usual, for those of you who have been watching for a while, you know that I've done patterns in translation before, and my go-to is usually Google Translate, but also there are tons of great individual knitting websites out there in the world that offer information about how to translate, you know, particular languages or particular cultural traditions into English, if English is your first language. And we did a KAL a couple years ago about knits in translation, and it just had to be something that was not in your native language. So a lot of people did English patterns because they were coming from somewhere else in the world where their first language was something else. And a lot of us did patterns in other languages because English was our first language. So it was a really fun KAL. I'm remembering that now. And I should go back to the Ravelry board on that and see if other people were doing Japanese knitting, because it would be a great resource actually. There's also a couple of really wonderful books. There's one called Knitting Languages, which I'm looking at right on my shelf right now, that does basic translations for a lot of different popular knitting languages. So there are a lot of resources out there available. I tend to go to Google Translate first. And one of the issues with Japanese knitting patterns is that since the language is a symbolic language, it's often difficult to get it into Google Translate. So yeah, I did a few backflips there as well, and finally got it parts of it translated so that I could understand the basics and then kind of come up with the rest. Luckily, it's a pattern that is full of charts, and yeah, so the portion of the knitting that is the pattern is charted, so you can figure that out, just work backwards. And then I worked up my gauge swatches, of course, and this is a pattern that has a beautiful, let's see if this will, yeah. It has a beautiful, it's called the Twig stitch pullover. So it has this gorgeous twisted stitch that kind of runs all over the body and up the sleeves. And I did my best to translate it. So this is what I came up with. And I think you'll agree when you've seen the original that this is pretty close to what the original looks like. This is actually the yarn that I was waiting for, and this is the yarn that was used in the pattern. It's a Rowan yarn, Rowan felted tweed, I think, which I haven't used before. It's mostly wool with a little bit of alpaca and acrylic in it, which surprised me a little bit. I washed this and I love the way it feels. It has the most gorgeous kind of like halo and softness, so I'm pretty happy that I went ahead and chose this yarn. My gauge is nowhere near the gauge of the pattern, so and that's fine because I'm already writing the pattern out. My gauge is somewhere around 24 or 25 stitches for every 4 inches. So I think I'm gonna go with a size 3 needle. I was on a 4 and then I went to a 2, and I think the 3 is gonna be just right. So I'm gonna cast that on and see what I think. One of the important things, of course, especially if you're new to knitting sweaters, is that when you make your gauge swatch, you want to think about the fabric of your actual sweater. So sure, you know, this side has stockinette because I was making it in the round, but you want to make sure that you're actually working up the stitch pattern that the majority of the sweater is in, or if there are multiple stitch patterns, that you work up a swatch for each one so that you can actually get a good sense of how many stitches per inch you're going to be working. And in this case, given that the background is pearl with these twisted stitches, my gauge was not 21 stitches for every 4 inches. It was more like 24 or 25 on these needles. And you also have to think about your fabric, like if you're happy with the fabric that you're producing. So for me, I'm not totally happy with the fabric I'm producing at a size 4 needle, which is why I went to a size 2, which is too dense. So that's why I think I'm going to go with the size 3. And then it's just a matter of numbers. So if you know your gauge, then you can just start working up figuring out how to do the pattern. The pattern that I'm working on is a raglan, so I know the basics of raglan construction, and I'm just going to use that knowledge to try to interpret what's going on in the recipe, and hopefully in the next episode I'll have more to show you than just a swatch, and we'll see. It's a little bit of a scary moment because, you know, I don't want to promise something I can't give you, but I think the learning along the way is also something that you all seem to appreciate. So yeah, I'll tell you how it's going in a couple of weeks. So yeah, that's my Japanese knitting pattern story. Love this pattern, and I'm looking forward to seeing it come to life on my needles. So as promised, the last segment of the cast today is about the kind of backstage work that goes on in the knitting industry. And as I mentioned, I've been doing some research that requires me digging in there a little bit. So I found this really cool publication that maybe many of you already know about. It's called Wool to Yarn, literally wool and then the number 2 yarn. And there are a couple different ones. There's Wool to Yarn Global and there's Wool to Yarn China. Those are the 2 main magazines that I found from this particular company. This is from the International Trade Publications, which is an Australia-based media company, and they run these 2 main magazines about the wool industry, or for the wool industry. And it makes sense because Australia is a huge leading producer of wool, and they have been for a very, very long time. And I know this partially because of the research that I'm doing that's historical and has to do with export, sanctions and all kinds of, anyway. So this Australia-based media company, it puts out these two different magazines, Wool to Yarn Global and Wool to Yarn China, and you can go look at them free of charge. There's a digital version, and I think the most recent editions, you might be able to download them if you're interested in actually downloading something and not reading it on a screen. The one that I looked at, the Wool to Yarn Global, was from 2020 to 2021, in the midst of the pandemic. So there's a lot of really interesting industry talk in there about what's going to happen with the pandemic and how consumers are going to respond and how supply lines are going to work out and all of those kinds of questions that you would expect from the industry. But the magazine is also, I think, really useful to someone who's a hand knitter, in part because it allows you a kind of window into your favorite yarn producers and the background on like where things are milled, what kind of mythology has been created around, particular knitting traditions versus what's actually happening on the ground with the spinning mills, and where your wool is being shipped and exported and imported, and who's washing it and who's spinning it. And yeah, you just get a good insight into some of the brands that, you're really interested in and where they're coming from, like more of their story or their narrative, because that's not always out there, to be consumed by all of us consumers. So one of the things that I found really interesting in this particular issue, the 2020-2021 Wool to Yarn Global, was a section on Nordic knitting. There's also a section on Japanese knitting, which was equally fascinating. And it turns out Japan has been a huge wool importer for a very long time, ever since some laws that were passed at the end of the 19th century that basically made wool from Australia tax exempt, so you could import a lot of Australian wool. And in fact, by the 1970s, it sounds like, according to this article I was reading, Japan was importing 370,000 tons of wool a year. So that's a lot of wool to be importing. Anyway, and then a lot of it, once it was, industrially processed, was then exported to the United States. So there you go. So there's a section on Japan in this magazine, but there was a section on the Nordic region as well. And some of the things that were interesting in there that you all might be interested in going and checking out is, they talked about Norway, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, I'm forgetting Denmark. I think those were, I'm thinking I got everybody. And for me, it was really interesting, having just done this Lopi yarn experiment, to read about Istex, the company that produces Lopi yarn, and what's going on in Iceland, actually. So it turns out that Istex is, unlike some of the other Nordic countries, it's a company that does source its wool more locally, and it scours its wool locally, and it spins its wool locally. It doesn't weave locally. It turns out there's no actual weaving mill in Iceland, which I thought was pretty interesting. But all that Lopi yarn that you get from Istex, it is a private company that does source its wool from farmers in Iceland, which I thought was really cool. They also happen to have configured their carding machines to be able to deal with Icelandic wool. And Icelandic wool, as many of you know, has the thog and the thell. And, that's the long hair and then the short downy part. And so carding them, they tend to get carded together because the process of separating them would be really labor intensive. But the Istex company has figured out a way to set their carding machine up so that it can handle both parts of that dual coated fleece. And that's why the Lopi yarn is the way that it is, because they're carding it all together like that. There was some talk apparently now about maybe getting a de-hairing machine so that they could separate the two, and then that yarn would be even softer than merino potentially. And I guess there's a mini mill going on, a mini mill growth that's happening in Iceland that might be able to support that kind of thing. It hasn't happened yet, but if that were true, then that downy part of the dual coat is supposedly softer than merino. And when I've worked with Icelandic fleece, it's incredibly soft when you separate it out from the kind of more hairy long part. Anyway, that's all an aside. What I wanted to tell you too is that the Istex Lopi company, they're one of the few companies that source pigmented fleece, or fleeces that aren't white for the production of their yarn. So we were talking in a couple episodes ago about how that purple in the my Lopi sweater that I used, the purple had this depth of color with some reds and browns and blues and things in it. And part of that is because the company uses this pigmented wool. Like, they're not afraid to bring in non-white wool and scour it and blend it and dye it. So you get this kind of depth of color, I think, that you don't get in other processes. So these are all things you can learn from these industry magazines, and I think it's really fascinating, you know, to learn about the fact that what's going on in Finland or in Sweden. Like, it turns out that in Finland, one of the big products and exports is actually wood and not wool. So they're looking at things like viscose fibers and not so much at wool. Or that in Sweden there's a preference from consumers for synthetic fiber as instead of wool. So these are all really interesting things that from an industrial standpoint, you know, they're thinking about what do the consumers want? What can we give them? Like, what are we able to produce? Where are we getting our wool? Where are we sourcing things? And then what are the processes that we can put things through? What machines do we have? What options do we have? You know, export taxes and the politics of all of it. So it's really fascinating. And if you're like me and you're really interested in where your wool comes from and your yarn comes from, and you're curious about the industry and the technology that they're using and the logics that they're using for why they do certain things instead of something else, or what they think customers are thinking, or you know, all of the legal political stuff about imports and exports, and the question of who can scour wool, like where are the scouring plants, and all these things, then reading a magazine like this that's intended for the industry, people in the wool industry, is really a great resource, because I don't even know if they know we're reading it. So that's like my little homework for you, is like to go off and check out this Wool to Yarn Global magazine, or Wool to Yarn China, and see what you think. I'd love to know what you think about getting to know your yarn a little bit from the industry standpoint. You all know that I have the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, where I source small batch yarns and I try to tell you the story of where this came from, and you get to meet the people and the sheep. And that's all on such a small scale. You know, these are, you know, I just introduced you to Elena last week, who's from Cactus Hill Farm out in Colorado, and she's a 6th generation farmer raising this really interesting biodiverse flock of sheep. And that story is one story, but then, you know, you turn to the larger industry where you have tons and tons of wool literally coming and going in these various countries. And it gets exponentially, like, stranger. So if you're interested in the stories of where your wool comes from or where your yarn comes from, I'd highly recommend trying to get a little window into these larger companies and where they're located and where they're doing their business, and like what's actually happening with your yarn from fleece to skein. So anyway, there's my little PSA for you. And I will put links down below to the Wool to Yarn Global and Wool to Yarn China industry publications, so that you can check them out if you're interested. So last but certainly not least, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been doing some destashing, trying to go through things and move things out of my house that I'm not using right now that could find a better home. So as I mentioned, I have the destash page up on knittingthestash.com. Top menu, go to more, destash will pop up and you can go over there. There are even some freebies over there, which is kind of fun. I want the stash to find good homes, right? And I thought I'd do a little giveaway on here as well, because it's springtime, even though it was just sleet raining, snowing. And I have some beautiful springy, kind of pretty sparkly yarns that I'm just not going to use. I have a lot of yarn in my house, and I'm not going to use these anytime soon, so I want them to go to a good home. So I thought we would do a giveaway, and I thought this time we'd split it so that there would be 3 winners. So I'll send 3 people 2 skeins each, some fun blend of springy sparkle land. These are yarns from Knit Crate that I absolutely love, but like I said, I don't have time to use them, and there's not enough here for a sweater, and you know that's what I usually knit. So I want them to go to a good home. Maybe somebody wants to make a pair of socks, or a cute hat, or a baby garment, or something like that. These would be perfect for that. A lot of them are a mixture of either superwash merino and some stellina, or nylon, or this one has mohair in it. There's just tons of really fun blends here, but they all have a little bit of sparkle and they're all these springy, happy colors. So it seemed like an appropriate time of year to be doing this giveaway. So let me know down below in the comments what you're looking forward to this spring. That's it. And I will pick 3 winners in a couple weeks time and through a random draw, and y'all will get some yarn fun for the springtime. Yeah, and my stash to you, right? So head on over to the website and check out the D-Stash page if you're into that kind of thing, or leave a comment here if you'd like to enter to win some of this fun, sparkly, springy yarn for the giveaway in a couple of weeks. And there's all the details will be below in the comments. If you're an international entrant, I have some information down there about shipping. Yeah, but otherwise, good luck to you. I will see you in a couple of weeks, and thanks so much for hanging out with me today in the yarn room. Take care. Bye-bye.